Hello, everyone. I'm Vern Davis. I'm your host of Plant Profits, and I want to thank you all for joining us here today on Plant Profits. And I tell you what, our guest today I think this is a very timely discussion because there's so much in the air that I would love for him to clear up for me in discussions of legislation and cannabis reform, and all kinds of things. And we got the right person for this, the right guy, Mr. Andrew Freedman, who is the executive director of the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation. Andrew, welcome to the show. Welcome to Plant Profits, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So you got to tell me, you're the executive director, Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation. What does that all mean? Break it down for us.
Yeah, just to take you through a little bit of my background and how we came to start what we call CPEAR, so we don't have to say that word all the time, or that long sentence. I was a lawyer in Governor Hickenlooper's cabinet in Colorado, working on early childhood issues when they legalized cannabis. And
so you were there at the beginning.
I was there at the beginning, and in fact, he said, "You need to be cannabis czar of this." So I
became the czar of what?
Of cannabis.
No, I know, but of what? What was it, right?
So yeah, I mean, right. It was hard to know whether that meant I had drawn the short straw or
right.
It was exciting for sure, but I was the youngest guy around, and they're like, "You're the guy to go do this." So, overseeing the rollout, making sure that all the regulatory systems work together, making sure that people got the right messages on driving while high, on preventing youth use, making sure that we had some solution for banking in the interim of the federal government not moving on this. Liaisoning with the federal government and other states, really to make sure all the things that need to row in the same direction were rowing in the same direction. I then was the only one with that knowledge, so I worked for 19 other governments, helping them implement new cannabis laws, and that was everything from cities and counties to Canada, all on the notion that I was just kind of like a technocratic nerd there for them.
Okay. Now, this was all happening in 2014 when you became the czar?
Yeah, I mean, it was really from 14 through 19. So I left being the czar after 3 years.
You did? Okay.
And then started a little boutique consulting firm that
is the czar thing, so you consulted other governmental municipalities and states and countries, I guess, Canada. Yeah. And so is the czar, is it a real thing? I mean, after you've done it, right? Is it a real thing?
So czar is a government shorthand in the United States that means something that completely different than, say, a Russian czar. In the United States, when a government has a really complicated issue that spans multiple agencies and is all the governor says, "I want one person in charge, even if it runs through your agency." Andrew Freedman, everything that has the word cannabis on it, go talk to Andrew Freedman.
Right.
And that's what a czar is in the United States.
Got it. So you're like home plate. They got to touch you.
You don't come and talk to the governor about something cannabis related without having checked with me first.
Got it. Yep. Got it. Okay. All right. And as you consulted these other places, did you have them set it up the same way?
I mean, we certainly suggested that a coordinating function was really important given how complicated this was, and it kind of needed to raise to the level. And there's been a lot of different ways that this has taken shape. And most of the time, the kind of lead enforcement person who was head of the regulatory agency, that would be kind of considered the czar of that cannabis world. I think it was probably more important to have somebody in the governor's office that was the czar, just because, again, this is complicated and hits a lot of different agencies. So,
yeah. No, it really does. So you did that for 5 years. You were czar and then czar coach.
Yep, that's right. That's
That's
a great
right.
way to put it.
So let's talk about what you're doing now, right?
Yep.
So as the executive director of CPEAR,
Yep.
okay, as the
Yep.
executive director of CPEAR, what does that mean, and how did that start? How did you get that going?
So while doing all this work for the states, I really came to the conclusion that the states were doing a kind of as good of a job as they could, given
Hmm.
how crazy this kind of federal state tension was.
Yeah,
And a lot of the conversation I was personally interested in having is it is it cannabis legalization is no longer a are you for it or against it. It is here. It is the same as alcohol at this point, right? That there is just
yeah,
it is crossed the tipping point that the genie's no longer going in the bottle, the horse is no longer going back to the shed. Like there's no half of Americans now, it was a little less before, but half of Americans now have access to adult use cannabis. There's no world in which that is going to go away. And it was time for the federal government to acknowledge that reality and
right.
do some of its basic functions, or at least allow states to do some of their basic work without fear of federal retribution. And I decided it was worthwhile to put together the voices that would help make that happen. And so the coalition has some new voices to the table.
Okay.
Some of them, one of them is other highly regulated industries, which comes with its own baggage, but also
Yeah, I
its own.
think we're going to talk about that today
Yeah,
because it
yeah,
does have some baggage. Sometimes it seems like there's conflicting arrows.
yeah. I
But
mean, I think that
yeah,
they have lessons learned for sure, and things that people don't want to see for sure. And
of course.
but we
So,
mixed that with
so
voices.
but you knew that was going to be controversial.
Yeah, absolutely.
You knew that was going to, but you felt there's a conviction you had that that was important. And is that because and I'm making a statement and ask a question at the same time? I
Yeah,
can do that.
yeah.
So is that because um, in your mind the insight that is brought to the organization was more valuable than some of the battles you knew you were going to have to engage?
Yeah, and I think even kind of more fundamental than that,
Okay.
these are all of these stakeholders, both the people who are upset about highly regulated industry beginning in and highly regulated industry are going to be
Yeah.
involved in a
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
in a national. And whether you're upset about it or not, like we all have to reach a consensus on where this goes, right?
Yeah.
And if we don't, if you kind of want to just close your eyes and pretend like those groups don't exist, you're welcome to. You're just not going to end up with good policy, um, uh, and you're
Well,
gonna, yeah,
go ahead. No, I was just going to say, Andrew. I mean, these highly regulated people that you brought into the fold are folks that are they're protecting their interests because they want to be the answer to the exits of many cannabis related businesses.
I mean they for sure have a financial interest in what's going on,
Right.
uh, and they know too that um, they can't put forward a vision that doesn't include or small businesses succeeding, middle-sized businesses succeeding, um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and they're like, great, come to the table, small businesses, and let's figure this out together. Um, what I learned in Colorado, one of the I think most critical things we did was right after legalization passed, we started the Amendment 64 task force, which the 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 ability to be on the Amendment 64 task force was if you think you have a stake in legalization, if you think
Mm-hmm.
you have a public health concern, a public safety concern, if you want to be industry, if you are industry, um,
Yeah.
if you simply worry about what it's going to do to your community, you have a spot on this council, you have a spot on this task force. Let's hear all the voices. And then, with the exception of we are not going to repeal Amendment 64, it is going to go through, and then the
Yeah.
spirit of Amendment 64 is going to go through. Let's figure out how to achieve as many visions as possible.
And that you brought that learning
Yeah.
to
And that
this.
in essence is
Yeah.
CPEAR. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, which is and people on Amendment 64 task force didn't like each other as well. There were people very upset that it had passed, and there were people very thought that every regulation was one regulation too many because
Uh-huh.
the plant should govern itself. And you
Uh-huh.
that's just the nature of governing.
It's natural. Yeah, you made a decision to lead and manage and direct natural chaos.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just everybody's got an interest or a misinterest in what happens, and it's something. And I want to dive into. So we talked about one of the elements of what you've created and CPEAR. But I want to talk about the other ones because I think the strength comes from a lot of the diversity
Yep.
that comes in what you've created, Andrew. So we're going to take a quick break and then we'll come back and we'll dive into that. I'm Vern Davis. I am your host of Plant Profits, and Plant Profits is brought to you by Produce Global. And my guest today is Mr. Andrew Freedman, Executive Director of CPEAR, Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation. We'll be right back. You by Produce Global. My guest today is Mr. Andrew Freedman. He's the Executive Director of the Coalition of Cannabis Policy, Education, Regulation, known as CPEAR. So, Andrew, you brought this coalition of diverse interests about the plant and how it should be regulated, legislated, et so we talked about one. You brought other highly controlled substances into the mix, representation, and what are some of the other elements of the makeup of the coalition?
Yeah, really the core of where we get our content and best practices, we call our
Okay.
Center of Excellence.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
And that group, we actually have worked pretty hard to create a wall between that group and the highly regulated industry so that they feel like they can speak their mind and get what they want out there. And the director of that is Shanita Penny, who I believe has been on your
I know.
program.
Yeah, I know Shanita.
Yeah.
Yeah, she does great work.
Person.
Yeah.
Former head of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. And really there also to make sure that every voice that she knows, I mean, she's had one of the longest histories in cannabis out there that
Yeah.
We get voices from people who have been arrested before from legalization or from cannabis, people who are entrepreneurs in the space, small business voices. We have people like Dr. Gruber, who is at Harvard Medical School, and I think the leading voice on what this does to the brain, both good and bad, and what we can know there. We have responsibility.org, who helps us think through driving under the influence.
Okay.
And it has now grown to over a dozen members in our Center of Excellence, and they're really every voice there. Some of them represent state associations, state government associations, because state governments are like, we need to be the leading voice on this, and how do we get out there? Some represent specific ethnic groups who want to make sure that they have the right social equity tools to come through.
Yeah, of course, yes, yeah.
And essentially what we do with that group is we say, what are the 7 biggest issues right now? And let's put them in a queue. Let's write up what we think should be the answers to those issues, and then let's push them out. And I think importantly, no one gets through. They're the last voice in what gets pushed out. So there's no editorializing if what they think is the next best practice.
So that forces everyone to get somewhat on the same page.
Yeah. It is the way of trying to level out the playing field a little bit. There's these corporations with clearly a lot of power,
right?
And you are bringing in your voice and letting your credibility to this. And as part of that, the promise from us is you get to say what you want to say.
Right.
And that's, becomes the view of CPEAR.
Right. No, I got it. So how do you mobilize this diverse group of folks and point them in a direction that is going to benefit?
I think there's a lot. What's so interesting about cannabis is, despite all the infighting, and there's more infighting in cannabis than any place I've ever. I was part of education reform before this, and I thought I was like, I can't believe how much infighting there is in education reform. And then I was like, wait, just hold on, it gets much worse. And that's cannabis. despite all of that, like I believe if you put me in my room with the people who just trust me the most, we'd
Right.
come up with 93% the same policy of what this needs to look like on the federal level.
Okay.
We'd probably argue bitterly over the last 7%, but a lot of it is really like what are the next steps for driving under the influence? What do
Yeah.
we do about youth use prevention? What do we do about substance abuse? And like, what have we learned so far that we can apply to these practices?
Hmm.
And and it's almost boring. Like, there's some great lessons out there that just show, oh, okay, like youth use of tobacco and alcohol is lower than it's ever been in recorded
Hmm.
history.
Okay.
So what have we learned from those things that can be applied to cannabis? And what have we learned from cannabis from the 21 states that are going through adult use that need to be applied to federal cannabis? Um,
Hmm.
uh, and um, and so a lot of that is just circling that all up, putting like actually making it actionable for Congress, saying
Hmm.
here's
Hmm.
how this comes to a group of suggestions. And then the second half of it is really convincing this group how big this conversation needs to get. I
Okay.
think on the federal side, we're never going to get there unless this becomes I would say nonpartisan, but for lack of a better term, bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
Until
Is that, are we making progress there? Because, and I made this statement, and I've said it out loud, is that, man, if there would be one of the parties, the Democrats or the Republicans, one of them just really put their arms around cannabis, right, and just lead and say we're going to be the identity, we're going to be the leaders for this. Number one, they do a lot of good, and number two is they win a lot of elections.
yeah, I think Democrats have done it like 65%, right?
Okay.
And they get kind of there,
Uh-huh.
and then it's like, well, this is number 50 on our list of priorities right now, and so you're gonna have to wait your turn. And you've seen Congress; they get through like the first four issues, and then
Right.
um, it's really hard to prioritize. But also, like at the end of the day, you need 60 votes to get through the Senate side, and
Yeah.
um, I don't ever imagine a world where we have 60 Dems and that all 60 Dems are going to vote yes on cannabis. It's
Right.
just, if that's what we're waiting for, we'll be waiting for a really long time. I think what it's going to take, and we've seen this with other things, is cannabis on the voter level, on the citizen level, is already polling in the sky high range, and it's
70%, right? Something
yeah,
like
it's
that. Yeah.
60%, depending on how you word the question, somewhere between
Okay.
60 and 70%.
Right.
And depending on how you word the question, even 60% support amongst Republicans for,
Okay.
I mean, specifically amongst Republicans, if you say states should be allowed kind of determine their own destiny here, they're like, yeah, of course, like they should.
Okay.
And um,
Is that
uh,
the answer though? Seriously, is that the answer? Is allowing states? Well, I mean, there's some
oh,
federal things needs to
yeah,
take place about crossing borders, with money and product and all of those some foundational things. But at the end of the day, is it most of it's going to be in the hand of the state?
yeah. I mean, what we say is states need to lead and the federal government
Mm-hmm.
needs to support. Uh, the states have already kind of set up their own economies around this and their own licensing systems. And
Right.
it's not really, federal government, first of all, is terrible at picking licenses. If we ever end up in a place where it's like the federal government's job to say you should have a license and you shouldn't, what has already been a disaster on the state level will be a massive disaster on the federal level. And the federal government knows that. I don't think they have any interest in doing that kind of work. They
Right.
just are going to permit at the federal level. The federal
Okay.
government's job is provide the science and data. People need to do this right.
Mm-hmm.
Provide standards that are the floor that
Mm-hmm.
states can go above for what is a safe product.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that testing is done correctly across, so that cannabis in Florida is the same as cannabis in Hawaii,
Mm-hmm.
and when it says something on the label, that is actually what it is on
Yeah.
the label.
Let's get there soon.
Um, yeah, so and then things like there needs to be national standards for what it means to be driving while high. There needs to be a moonshot work towards coming up with intoxication tests, and
Mm-hmm. Should there be an age, a legal age?
So for non-medical use of it, we support a 21 plus
Okay.
universal.
Uh-huh.
Like we do believe there should be medical exemptions to that, and the way this
I agree.
the way this works out right now is that means states get to decide that as well, that they're qualifying conditions for under the age of 21. So to kind of circle back to, most of those answers are answers that I think Republicans like.
Okay.
Like, yeah, that is the role of the federal government. We would like to see those things. And we do think states should be determining the future. And to bring it all the way back to like 3 questions ago from you on that, is that's what's going to, the only thing that's going to cause either party to really grab this and hold it up and say, this is my thing, is when it becomes a race between the 2 parties. If the Dems start to see like, oh,
well, that's what you should be doing, right? Creating this fire.
It's literally what I spend all my time doing.
Absolutely. You got to light that fire, man. But hey, look, we're going to take a quick break, Andrew. And when we come back, we're going to dive in some of the specific things that you guys are fighting for. And I appreciate you here. This is Vern Davis. I am your host of Plant Profits, and Plant Profits is brought to you by Produce Global. My guest today is Mr. Andrew Freedman, Executive Director of the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation, CPEAR. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to Plant Profits. I'm Vern Davis. I am your host of Plant Profits. Plant Profits is brought to you by Produce Global. My guest today is Mr. Andrew Freedman, Executive Director of the Coalition of Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation, CPEAR. So Andrew, let's continue our discussion here. So, okay, so you are building that fire, and I'm so glad to hear you are doing that, because I totally agree. That is the strategy for someone in your position, is to create that competition to support driving the support of cannabis at the federal level. Where are we with some of the reforms? If you were to stack them, what are the priorities for the constituency that you serve, and what are the priorities for the legislators?
This is such a hard question, because you essentially have to boil the ocean, right? Like, because the priority is, we need a science data-driven market that has, all of the trappings of a normal consumer packaged good, which means interstate commerce, testing, the data and science from the federal government that says this is working, this is not working, this is potentially very, very harmful. We need to essentially advanced in the matured system like 30 years down the road, and you're not going to do that all at once. So what we essentially say is, it's just time. The most important thing is, it's time to go flip the switch from the federal government having this weird, you have our forgiveness, not our permission to do this, to we are now actively engaged. And that will require descheduling, and then getting actively engaged in this process. So that in short is it. I mean, we don't believe on day one, when the federal government gets engaged, they should bring all the powers that they put on other highly regulated products onto cannabis. That would be a disaster, right? Like, this is going to they're going to have to meet state markets where they're at, and over time start to say like, hey, here's the next best evolution that you guys can go through to make the product a little safer, to create less consumer confusion, to create more national uniformity. Then here's the next step you can go through, and have an iterative process down the road.
Yeah, I look at it, and I agree with you. I mean, there's certain things that we want the federal government to do. The thing that just concerns me is that when the states have control of this, and then municipalities, that really, there's got to be a business of going in and really teaching these operations and these governmental groups and these policy whacks, these folks to really build. How do you build a successful business? How can you regulate, tax, and allow the consumer product to flourish? And that to me is because you see these new states open, like Jersey, right? So states open up, they're on fire. Everybody's happy. Then all of a sudden, you know, California, Colorado, Washington happens to them, right? I mean, you get the price of the product drops. There's there's the operators are hard to stay in business. The taxation is, you know, is all over the place. You know, I mean, this thing could really be a real benefit to these to the citizens of these municipalities and states by actually taking care of some of the financial burden on some of the support that the citizens need to have a better quality of life in many areas. And I just see it floundering.
Yeah, I mean, it has been, I think, a couple failed to launch scenarios where, you know, a whole municipality can't figure out how to, or sometimes a state can't figure out how to compete with the illicit market while dealing with all the things it wants to accomplish at the same time.
Right.
I think some people have tried to say, like, let's turn on the entire system on day one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, the system can't support that on day one. People don't have enough capital and know-how and knowledge, and there's not enough maturity in the system to support all the things you want to do on day one. And those have been hard lessons to come by, and ones that, you know, states, I think, have found a lot of ways to repeat the same mistake over and over again. I'm not sure there's a great way around that. I think this is going to be bumpy for a long time.
Okay.
First of all, there is an ongoing way of everyone getting cannabis. I think one of the mistakes people have in their head is that they're like launching a new industry. You're not. You're launching a competing industry.
Yeah, the industry is been thriving for over 2,000 years.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So you're now competing with that industry.
Yeah.
You have some advantages and you have massive disadvantages, and like, make sure you know that your advantages are going to outweigh your disadvantages, and that everything you want to accomplish, because I think there is a Christmas tree of things that these states want to accomplish, that you can actually do it all. And I think that those are always the hard conversations, saying like, you can't do that part. We have that conversation all the time on testing. People want testing to be up and running on day one, and we're like, that's a great way of ruining your own regulatory system. It took Colorado really 3 years to fully bring on testing. We could bring on parts at a time, but we didn't have the capacity to do it. We didn't have the testing labs didn't have the knowledge to do it. And like, really, quite frankly, a lot of the growers would have failed. And it would have taken all of the cannabis off the shelves, and would have sunk the whole cannabis economy. And those are the kind of things where, you know, if you really get in and you tell them, like, you can do this, like, you can say day one or it fails. But if you do it, you're just going to fail your own system. You know, it's those lessons 1,000 times over. But you know, that knowledge base is growing. It's hard because, you know, sometimes that takes current industry to come in and educate and lobby up, and then, you know, and then people are upset because industry's in there and lobbying, and some of it is lobbying for protectionist reasons, and other of it is lobbying because people actually need to be educated on how this works. So it's complicated, it's messy. I think it's like democracy. It's the worst system except for all the other systems. So it's the worst way to do this, except for every other way of doing this.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing with us today, Andrew. But before I let you go, I can't pass this up. I mean, I ask all my guests to kind of make some predictions about cannabis and short-term and long-term predictions. And now I got the man here with me, and who's on the forefront fighting these battles. And so when you step back, you put your sword down, man, what do you see as what's going to happen here? Do we have anything that's going to happen during lame duck? What's going to happen? What do you see happening? Talk to us. We need you now, Andrew.
I'm so nervous that the day that this goes up, like I'll already have been proven wrong, and it'll sound like the most. It'll sound like
Don't worry about it. It would be normal.
yeah. So on safe, which I think there's a lot of people with bated breath, hoping that's safe, and probably like literally today or tomorrow we have to see language. Today is Wednesday, November 30th. Either today or tomorrow we have to see language for there to be any chance that it has the kind of socialization to pass. Because
there's only so many meetings left, right?
I think we're down to like 14 days at this point where
okay.
Both the Senate and then the House. My guess is whatever passes, we'll need to repass the House. Both those in. And for the timeline alone, I think it's it's a Hail Mary throw. The good news is it's one Hail Mary throw, not like
okay.
throws.
Okay. All right.
And people catch Hail Mary passes. I'd much rather be the other team when it's a Hail Mary pass to end the day, but we've all seen the highlight clips. It happens. I just think it remains. There's too many things that are not about cannabis that remain the larger issue here. Are we gonna pass an actual budget, or is it going to be a continuing resolution? If it's a continuing resolution, I think that really limits.
It kills you. Yeah.
What we can actually pass this on.
Right.
They could try to put it back on NDAA again, but it's already gone over to the Senate, and the Senate says this can't be a part of NDAA. So somebody would have to bend there. There's not great feelings between the houses, the Dems. I will say I do believe that Schumer is committed to getting this passed. I think he's working hard. I just think he's also committed to getting 15 other things passed. And
right.
And so,
well, that's normal. That's his job.
That's just the way it goes.
Yeah.
Long-term prospects. I think we are within the last 2 to 3 years of this being a real debate about legalization, and then it starts to be a debate about how best to implement. The polling is right on track with same-sex marriage, when it kind of flipped that switch of like everybody's like, maybe I have my own personal beliefs back home, but this is what I believe is right on the federal government side. And I like what I tell everybody is like really listen to voices outside your arena of people. I look at the Twitter echo chamber on this, and it's MSO groups convincing MSO groups of what's going on, and it's advocacy groups convincing advocacy groups of what's going on. And I think that's creating a lot of tunnel vision on what this needs to be. Listen to law enforcement groups. Like I think what's going to be the fastest thing to change a senator from a Midwestern state is if a law enforcement person comes out and says, I think we should be regulating this. That's really where there became movement over safe banking, was law enforcement and bankers saying this is untenable. And those voices reach different audiences than the current cannabis voices reach.
Interesting.
And that's not that. This is with all major political change. It is not to belittle the work that advocates and industry have done in this world. I think they have defied gravity with the work that they've done. But if you're going to want major social change in a major piece of legislation, that can't be the only voices. It has to be there has to be a big tent. And so you really need to start listening to, if you want to be able to predict the future, it's much more important to be paying attention to what a law enforcement community is saying, what a public health official is saying, who are voices that matter to the states' rights Republican who wants this, not voices that matter to the same Democrat who's already come out 30 times and said they support it.
Yeah.
That's the best way to predict the future.
Do you guys influence that at all?
I mean, we certainly put forward the argument that this is, I think by influence, what we would say is, do you want the best ways to battle driving under the influence? Do you want the best ways to make sure that cannabis remains in legal states only? Do you want the best ways to be able to police your communities in the way that they want to be policed? Then you have to back reform here. And we go out and try to find voices that see the sense in that. So yeah, it's where we spend a significant amount of time.
Got it. Andrew, that's going to have to be the last word. I'm Vern Davis. I am the host of Plant Profits, and Plant Profits is brought to you by Produce Global. Our guest today, Mr. Andrew Freedman, Executive Director of CPEAR, which is the Coalition of Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation. And I want to thank you all for joining us. And you can find Plant Profits anywhere you get your podcast. We're everywhere. And I know that for a fact because I get it everywhere. CannabisRadio.com, who's our partner in this project, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Give us top rating, 5-star ratings when you go. iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and Audible. Everywhere we're there with Plant Profits, which is brought to you by Produce Global. And follow Produce Global through our social media footprint. And that's everywhere also, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You can follow us and you can really dive into how we're building companies and how we're changing lives at ProduceGlobal.com. That is PROTIS global.com. Until next time, cheers.